Pot of Prosperity is the latest combination pot card, coming out in the TCG a couple months ago. Recently, I talked about the first ever pot card, Pot of Greed, and in light of the newest edition, I think it is a good time to give attention to the rest of the series. Pot of Greed draws 2 cards, which is an effect that is replicated in several, but not all of the later pots. I think the best way to tackle this topic is chronologically, to show the changes in balance and design philosophy over time. The first retrain is the opposite of Pot of Greed, Pot of Generosity. This card is a -3 in card advantage, for no real benefit. It is one of the worst cards in the game, but one of the best targets for Mystical Ref Panel. Maybe. Mystical Ref Panel is a ruling's nightmare, and is broken, but not in the overpowered sense. Hopefully someone is bold enough to bring a Pot of Generosity and Mystical Ref Panel to an event to clarify this ruling one day. Released later in the same year, Pot of Avarice is a +1 in card advantage, which does not deck thin when shuffling main deck monsters back into the deck. This card is recently unlimited, which might be scary for more seasoned players, as it enables loops and gives easy card advantage, but as the graveyard continues to grow in importance, maybe you would be better off keeping monsters there. Keep an eye on this one, because if there is another Danger or Dark World-like archetype that can really take advantage of the card, the lack of a once per turn restriction makes the ceiling nutty. Pot of Benevolence is a -1 in card advantage, but is arguably an upgrade to a card which spent a good amount of time on the FNL list, the Transmigration Prophecy. Pot of Benevolence is a turn faster, being a spell card, but cannot be used as a disruption tool to interfere with the opponent activating a resurrection card. Maybe a reasonable side grade, but not broken by any means. Pot of Duality is the first combination pot, borrowing from the effects of both Pot of Greed and Generosity. This card offers pretty strong card selection, digging 3 cards deep and letting you pick the best of the bunch. It also has a once per turn restriction and removes the ability to special summon for a turn. To me, this card is extremely well balanced, even if the meta has left the card behind in its acceleration. Pot of Dichotomy draws from the effects of Pot of Avarice and Benevolence, shuffling 3 monsters with different names into the deck, which might be the result of subtracting the 2 cards which Benevolence shuffles back from the 5 monsters required for Avarice, and then keeping the Draw 2 effect from Avarice. As far as restrictions, this card can only be activated at the start of main phase 1, and removes the battle phase for the turn. These may seem like oppressive restrictions, but raw card advantage is always tempting. Do note that the main phase restriction makes the card incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to use during the first turn of the duel, as a way to circumvent the battle phase forfeiture. Pot of Riches is pendulum support, with a function similar to Pot of Avarice. Shuffling a smaller number of specifically pendulum monsters back into the deck might seem like a lesser cost, but remember that pendulum monsters face up in the extra deck are a resource for the pendulum summon to bring back out. Which, by the way, the special summon restriction does not apply to the once per turn pendulum summon, although it may be difficult to establish a formidable board without other forms of special summoning. Pot of Desires combines Greed and Avarice, and has an activation condition which is a little far out. Banishing 10 cards face down might be the product of 2 cards drawn from the Pot of Greed, and the 5 shuffled from Avarice. This card has developed a reputation of being a -9 in card advantage, but this is very misleading. Cards in the deck are not material resources, and the card is squarely a +1. It does, however, have the risk of banishing key combo pieces or power cards, which is a big downside. There is a once per turn restriction, but would it really be a good idea to dig another 12 cards deeper into the deck? Pot of Acquisitiveness is a quick play spell card, which gives it so much initiative. It shuffles 3 banished monsters into the deck, which can be a disruption tool like Transmigration Prophecy, although interacting with the banished zone is far less common than with the graveyard. Drawing the card makes it better in material card advantage than Burial from the Different Dimension, which is another quick play spell affecting 3 banished monsters. But personally, I would prefer my Mizuki in the graveyard over being shuffled back into the deck. The next pot helps to load up the banish zone. Pot of Extravagance is a combination of greed and riches. This card is modal, giving you the option of banishing 3 or 6 random monsters from the extra deck face down, then drawing a card for each 3 cards which were banished. 6 is the product of 2 from greed and 3 from riches, by the way. This card is not once per turn, although the restriction which prevents drawing cards for the rest of the turn might make that restriction redundant. Like with Pot of Desires, this downside can range from unnoticeable to game-ending, making it for a high variance card. Pot of Prosperity is a combination of generosity and riches, with a drawback very similar to Extravagance, and has the same restriction on drawing cards for the rest of the turn. It banishes 3 or 6 monsters from the extra deck, then excavates cards from the deck equal to the number banished, with 1 selected to be added to hand, like with Pot of Duality. There is a once per turn restriction on the card as well, and it halves damage that your opponent takes for the rest of the turn. I think that it is neat that this card will not prevent you from activating Pot of Duality in the same turn, but that would lock the player out of special summoning on top of the other restrictions. How far are you willing to go for card advantage? I think this question applies to all the +1 pots since greed, but I am also interested in the much greater diversity of effects, which range from -3 in card advantage to -1 to neutral material card advantage but pretty good card selection to a +1 in card advantage. With the exceptions of Pot of Greed and Generosity, I think the cards are an appropriate power level, but the unlimited status of the cards indicates that none of them are universal staples. I like the risk and reward rationale behind these cards, as well as their implicit exclusivity. Without using archetypes, these cards each carve a unique niche, although Pot of Riches is pretty obviously pushed pendulum support. I am excited to see what pot comes next, because I have heard of drawing 2 cards from the opponent's deck, but maybe there will be something even further out of the box.